Hi everybody. We're gonna
Hey,
say hello.
Hi,
what's up? Hello.
Um,
Charles. You and I should have like some sort of sign that we give to each other to decide who's
Who
going to
goes
answer
first?
first.
Yeah.
Lori Lightfoot is everywhere. Since issuing a citywide stay-at-home order, Lightfoot found herself in the national spotlight as images of her encouraging Chicagoans to stay at home took on a life of their own. Soon, Lightfoot was being photoshopped onto city landmarks, in front of police barricades, and even in popular queer cruising areas. The double take of seeing Chicago's first queer mayor photoshopped in front of a police barricade at Steamworks aside, it is clear that Lightfoot has quickly become the stern face of Kerr in the age of COVID-19, which is kind of weird. Hi, my name is Eddie Gamboa. I am a instructor of communication studies and gender and sexuality studies, as well as the director of forensics at Governor State University. I've been thinking a lot about these Lightfoot memes, which I find a bit unsettling given Lightfoot's support of police enforcement of social distancing, despite CPD's high infection rate and their exclusive targeting of South and West Side neighborhoods. No matter what the memes may suggest, police barricades and disproportionate policies are not care. What does it mean to take care in the midst of a pandemic? Pandemics are times when the question of taking care becomes the most pressing because we find ourselves needing to find new ways of doing it. These are also questions that I'm returning to as I explore this in one of my classes that I'm teaching this summer called Rhetorics of a Pandemic. In it, my students and I look to responses to the HIV/AIDS pandemic for strategies, suggestions, and hope that it is possible to take care in the face of a cruel government and racist and capitalist healthcare systems, and in the face of an overwhelming sense of loss. While HIV/AIDS responses cannot give us all of the answers, they can give us an idea of the kind of work we need to be doing. So I'd like to share a conversation that I had on care, pandemics, and the work we can all do, which I had with two members of the What Would an HIV Doula Do collective. My first guest is a Canadian-born, Brooklyn-based writer, organizer, and artist whose work focuses on HIV/AIDS, community, and culture. His writing appears in Women's Studies Quarterly, The New Inquiry, Bomb, Lambda Literary, Pause Magazine, and others. He is a founding member of the What Would an HIV Doula Do collective, and most recently he has edited What You Don't Know About AIDS Could Fill a Museum for On Curating, and What Does a COVID-19 Doula Do for the One Archives Foundation. My second guest is a Chicago-based multidisciplinary artist, activist, and Black liberationist. His work explores issues of representation, legacy, and loss through papermaking, print, performance, and other mediums that lend themselves to the principles of the democratic multiple. His work has been exhibited at the DePaul Art Museum, La Ma Galleria, Radiator Gallery, and The Kitchen. Most recently, he has staged workshops and discussions at Northwestern University, Queens Museum, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. Folks, it is my pleasure to share my conversation with Theodore Ted Kerr and Charles Ryan Long of What Would an HIV Doula Do? Hi, I'm here with Charles and Ted. I feel like the basic question is, what would an HIV doula do?
So we're a collective of people across the United States who are interested in ensuring that people, specifically community, have a voice in the ongoing role of AIDS activism in the 21st century. We understand a doula as someone who holds space during times of transition, and that HIV is a series of transitions that start long before you might think about getting an HIV test and last long after you might be on treatment or even after death. We understand that doulas can help in the birth process, help in the abortion process, help in the end of life process. And so we are interested in thinking about what is the role of a doula in the ongoing AIDS crisis.
The only thing I'd add is that I think it's a playground for people who are concerned about being concerned with others and community and each other. and really take that to heart through the lens of what the HIV and AIDS struggle taught us, and the lessons that were learned through that. I think we're obviously living through a different time and a different space, but I think the same lessons are applicable. Like, where are the carers at? And I think it's a place for carers to go and create together around that impulse to care.
So with that idea of care, can you talk a little bit about the kind of care you think or you've come to understand an HIV doula to do? You've talked about transitions. What does the day-to-day care look like of what an HIV doula might undertake in their role?
I think for me, I think it's less than like a position in like a hospice. Let's say we wouldn't necessarily have a person who's stationed there, and it's more about how are we seeing each other in a regular way, in a regular behavior, and not just in this very much through the social media clouds of what people put out there about oneself, but actually seeing each other for like, what are your needs? What are you going through? What are your stated values, and where you stay within that? And it's stretching. I think I was at therapy yesterday, so I had that conversation about within my therapeutic relationship, but I think it raises that to the level of community, right? Like, who is going to be there for you? And it's old lessons, things we've known for time, like forever, and various communities have practiced forever, but it's a return to that in a very politicized lens. Like, right, we're doing this in an intentional way to make a point around that it takes all of us to actually achieve the changes we want to see and to survive, and not only survive but thrive, I guess.
I always go back to our first conversation as a collective. Before we were a collective, we were just a group of people asking the question. And at that first meeting was a birth doula who's also a midwife, Loads, and she talked about how when she's on a job, so a midwife is someone who does the birth work from the waist down, as she describes it, and a doula is someone from the waist up. And she describes a doula as like all the in-between holding space jobs that you can't quite make a list of. It's getting ice, it's talking to the partner, it's holding space so that the person can advocate for themselves with the nurse if the nurse is being racist. It's about just doing all those in-between things and being a support. And when Lode said that, Michael Crumpler, who was also in the room, said that that is also similar to what people in recovery can do for each other. He talked about how if you come over to my house and my bed is not made, that is me asking for some help. And so I think a doula is somebody that kind of does all those supports, all those ideas of care that Charles is talking about, and you can't really quantify it. And something that was important for us to think about is we're really good at looking, when we do look at AIDS history, we're really good at looking at the activists, we're really good at looking at the scientists and even the politicians and celebrities, but we're not really good at looking at the people that held all that juicy, lovely space in between that. And those are the doulas, the caregivers, the people who couldn't be famous, who couldn't hold a sign, who couldn't, do all that other stuff, who were, and I think about all the people that are doulas every day of their lives and they don't know it. So we also wanted to use this word to help people identify their really vital role in the ongoing work.
That's great. It's really great to think about the ways in which a lot of us are already doing that kind of work, even if we don't label it or name it or identify as doulas. And a lot of us are trying to find ways of doing that work under the conditions that we are currently under, right? Social distancing, the ways in which we can connect is asking us to maybe reimagine some of those things, or at least put them in different context. Can you both kind of talk about how your work with what would an HIV doula do and the conversations you've been having have prepared you for the kind of care that people need under the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think to Ted's point, I don't know if it has. I don't know, a question mark, right? Like so many things that are right now in our lives, I don't think we're done yet seeing the level of need in order to say how we would compensate for said need or to be there for it.
Mm.
One thing I do think is that in the history of, we have to think of a better like wizards or wizard, I can't, of doing of our work together, is that it moved from a conversation into a collective, in that there's some practice implied by that. And then if you're in practice of doing that thing, I guess that's what has laid the groundwork to be in this moment, right? Is to work out the complicated, like we were on a call last night that was really thinking at like the challenges in writing about the comparisons between HIV and COVID, right? And like, what are the pitfalls of doing that and making these kind of broader strokes, and what are the main differences, or what's similar, what is the same, and but what is different, and what allowed for that conversation to be present and for it to be an activated one was groundwork that had happened before this, and workshops like we had done around, and you know, yeah. So that's what I'd say about it.
Yeah, it's hard. It's actually like a pretty profound question, and I agree with Charles that I don't know even where to start, or if I'm ready to start. The number one thing that comes to mind as I'm thinking about, Charles is first and foremost my friend, but he's also someone that I look to as someone who puts things out in the world that exist when I need them. So he's made artwork that is very helpful for me, like the tote bag he made with visual aids that was asking us about the AIDS crisis, but is now, how do we care? And I think that's in a way what would an HIV doula do at the very basic, just brought a bunch of people together, and that in its way has become a support system. So that is my like touchy-feely answer. I would say more concretely, since the pandemic the COVID-19 pandemic has begun, the first thing we did was we started to do like these monthly Zoom calls where we invited people to come and meditate on a theme with us. So the first theme was let's not be afraid of each other. The second theme was let's dream about space together. And then the third one's going to be about time. And what happens during those calls is people come together and then we put them into break-off groups, and you get to talk to strangers from around the world about the intimacy of what's going on. And for me personally, I'm missing strangers. I'm missing being able to talk to people that I don't know. I'm missing being a face in the crowd. I'm sick of being alone in my room. And so those Zoom calls have been helpful. At the same time as we were doing that, we started production on a zine, and kind of a question that we're asking is what does a COVID-19 doula do? Not what would, but what does a COVID-19 doula do? And basically we wanted to create a zine that was a time capsule that found people's response in the moment. So we have the answers there from somebody like Tamara, who's been doing like harm reduction work up in the Bronx, providing like life-saving supplies to people who can't shelter in place because they don't have a shelter, whose addiction is very important to them, and that is what they're prioritizing. To the work of Pato, who is, tested COVID positive and is figuring out how to be an amazing human being from his bed. To someone like Saloni, who's been doing research into like the systemic crisis of AIDS and how that's going to help us understand what's going on with COVID. So that's, I guess the thing that's always been important to me is like cultural production. I don't know yet if it can save a life, but it makes a life worth living. And so that's what I've been focusing on, but I know that every doula will have their own answer to that question.
And I think just to add on to what Ted has said, and to the examples that he presented to the other folks who are involved, are that we come together as doers and as carers. And so like the lessons that we learned in the collective, we actually are going to end up in the lives of other people. That's one of the things I love about it, is like that is actually going to be spreading, to use, and viral. Like there will be like, that kind of, because there are people actually, we came to the conversation because we needed that space, and then because we're already out here taking care of our folks and in practice of this, so we need words and ways to call it, and community to share it with, and to I don't know what you call solidifying a practice or an idea, and so that's what I think is really powerful about the collective as well, that one conversation turns into many.
Well, speaking of these kind of conversations, I know that we're not the first to talk about some historical and maybe tangential links between HIV and AIDS and COVID-19. You mentioned the zine that was being produced, which I know was done in conjunction with One Archives, and artwork and some of the work that the collective is doing. And those are important connections. Are there any differences between the work of an HIV doula and a COVID-19 doula, or just between those two things in general that we should be mindful of? What is the difference between those pandemics?
Oh, Eddie, you are a dreamboat for asking that question. I think that it's so important to be talking about the differences, because that does name that there are similarities that we can learn from and that we can find joy and strength in. But I think for me, one of the major differences, and I don't even know how to articulate it yet, and I don't see other people articulating it, is like, there is a world of difference between a COVID-19 positive diagnosis and an HIV positive diagnosis. And when people make those kind of conflations, it is totally disrespecting how, both can result in death. I want to name that. We know that people have suffered with COVID-19. I'm not trying to make light of like what it is to live with COVID-19 or to the people who have been lost to COVID-19. And I also want to name that COVID-19 criminalization is a real thing across the US, Canada, and the rest of the world. And that is a damn shame. And that is taking the worst of what's happened in HIV and applying it to COVID. Okay, so all that's real. At the same time, I feel very uncomfortable with people trying to kind of establish that living with COVID is the same as living with HIV. I don't think it carries the same stigma. I think once you're COVID positive and you get on the other side of what healthy might be, that your life can basically go back to normal. And even if we have the medication that can make HIV a manageable chronic illness, there is always the specter of the law. There's always the specter of joblessness, of homelessness, of all the things that an HIV status exasperates. And so there's that. I also want to say that we don't do enough thinking or talking or acting around which communities are overly represented in both HIV and COVID, and we're still figuring that out. I'm getting warm.
I would also add that it's some of it is as insulting as hearing people compare being stuck in the house to being like in jail.
Say that.
And it's just like exhausting. It's like, are you like, what planet are you on? In which they're like that, the comparisons of these two situations are completely misplaced. And like, it actually feels deadly, right? It feels harmful. It feels like the president saying the Chinese virus, like, right, inflammatory and actually bigoted and like horribly in the worst way, and like public bigotry that catches speak of things going on forever, that spreads and moves through people and becomes a viewpoint all of a sudden, and a way to discuss something that is dangerous to conflate in such a way, and that there are real consequences for the erasures that are being made. Like that's the clearest example I've seen recently that has felt like very viscerally like what, even if you're just you don't believe in abolition, whatever, I'm not asking you to be like standing beside me right now, but I'm just asking you to not to make these really dangerous comparative.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for some superficial comparison, right? The idea of the Chinese virus and then the 4-H club that we had as a rhetorical device during that first wave of AIDS, people being hospitalized, the fear of criminalization, a lot of things that on the surface seem to be operating the same way, even though, as Ted points out, the consequences of those things might look radically different, even if they might incur violence, even if they might incur like incarceration, hospitalization. They do exist differently, and I think it is important to name those. Charles?
I was just going to say, I think there are some very root things that exacerbate all of them. capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, right? Like, let's be really clear, there are some fundamental like things afoot that we can't, that like make everything worse, and that
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, some, and they have, you know, and so in that way, yes, they happened under their rule of all of those things, and in that way they operated and moved very similarly throughout our society and impacted those who were already vulnerable and will continue to impact those who are most vulnerable. Yeah.
And I think this is where how we all met was that workshop, Rage is Only Sustainable When Shared. This is where rage is quite helpful, because actually it is really important that you just named those things, Charles, and it's very important that we put that I feel all this rage. You know, I started to get upset, and it's a good reminder of where to put that upset. It's a good reminder that there's real things here that we can be pushing against.
But even in the context of this conversation, I think it's really valuable that it was shared in this moment, right? And that it will further be shared with this other community, other people, hopefully, who are watching this, have that same fire. And like, you give voice to something in a room, or not in this, and soon, hopefully, in the future, we'll be able to gather together in person and give voice in rooms together. But as long as we have this virtual space, we can still give voice to things that can, like, be like, oh, you know, because I found seeing you get upset got me upset, and like triggered that whole like chain of being like, yes, and this is just like, and this is how we get to the root of things, right? We get to the root of like what's happening. If this is something that we're sharing, like, oh, you feel that way, I feel it, okay, then we're no longer isolated. We're no longer, which is what those capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy do to us, make us feel that it's only us, or you imagine when that person was racist to you, or like whatever, like, you know, it'll trick you into thinking that what's happening is not actually happening. But the more we give voice to something, the more we can testify as to its reality to each other, and then therefore act upon that.
That's amazing, because it's a reminder as you're speaking that no one person can be to blame for all this, and not one person can figure this all out, that we actually need each other. And that is also what a doula does. A doula is literally like the physical human being that says you don't have to do this alone. You know, one of the things that we deeply believe is nobody gets HIV alone, so no one should have to deal with it alone. And that's on an individual level, but also a community level.
And speaking of the COVID comparisons, I think that's the same as well. What I feel right now, another thing is like, it's really enraging to see able-bodied young people, and if I'm being truly honest, mostly white, but I'm talking from like the southeast side of Chicago, not wearing masks and going about freely without. The most people I see wearing masks are Black and brown people, who, because they are the most at threat. They are the people around me, because again, I live on the southeast side of Chicago, so it's a segregationist space. But there are white people who live here who are not taking those same precautions. And it's if we're not collectively preventing this, what are we doing? Like, if we're not all sheltering in place and violating those rules, like, what is happening? Like, what's the point? Honestly, yeah.
Well, and you kind of bring up, let's talk about young people for a second, because and I only say this because this there is a divide from activists and artists and those who are connected along this spectrum, especially when it comes to things like care during a pandemic, who bore witness directly to that first wave of the US HIV pandemic. Where some of these ideas about care and community come from, and those who have only heard about it and are trying to figure out how to put that into practice under COVID-19. Do you have any advice for people who maybe this is the first time they've been personally impacted by a pandemic?
I mean, I think that some of the things I have seen in terms of mutual aid and already pre-existing systems, I'm 40 years old. claim it. Um,
41.
but yeah, but you know that I did not know when I was younger, right? You know, the idea of a GoFundMe or a Black Trans Travel Fund, or these ideas that people were already in a consistent dialogue and concerned with each other enough to be in survival mode, and depending on who you talked about previous to this moment. And so I think lean into that innovation, and you're doing things that people didn't do. I think we were talking, somebody in the conversation last night was talking about going to the New York Public Library archives and the HIV/AIDS archives there, and we're looking at like an old phone list and like that kind of thing. But I just see like, besides that, like maybe there are things that are rotary that people could click back into and become more or analog, I think that's the word, that people like click back into. But I actually don't think this moment calls for that. I think it calls for this, maybe it calls for both, a little bit of both, right? Like, I think things should necessarily, yes, be hyper localized, be concerned with your folks, right? And that be, by which I mean a circle enough that you can reach, and not necessarily the world at this moment all the time. But in the ways that you can, which digitally we can, and there's so much innovation that can be happening there, I think, again, lean into the communities that have already been creative, and continue to be explicit and brave, like unapologetic. I think is a thing that now like we treat as being common law, but like, or like, verbiage. But I feel like it just was an innovation, especially like I heard it first from the Black Youth Project 100 and their uses of it around Blackness. And I think we hear it now and people treat it as like a common thing. And it's like, no, actually, this is the last decade in which we've seen people stand up and do what they needed to, from the people who had mutual aid networks set up in California because of fire stuff, and to the stuff we saw right before COVID, to like the same networks that were used in the fire in Oakland were the networks that were used to defend the mothers who were squatting in that house, right? So we have these networks. We have, again, we are our traditions and our everybody's individual indigeneity in some way. There was a coexistence that happened. We've only been tricked out of it and told that it was not there, under the guise of normalcy and whiteness, to be honest with you. But like, it's actually innate in all of us. And so like, start to like lean into those and allow those who have the most at stake to be like, not tokenized members of a decision-making body or space. You have to center those people in their innovations, because again, there are people who have already been living under these conditions, and so we need to just listen to them.
Everything you said times 1,000. I am an HIV negative 41-year-old white dude. HIV has impacted my life tremendously. At the same time, I'm also very wary of AIDS exceptionalism or trying to draw lessons just from AIDS activism, because oftentimes, and I don't think we're having a conversation like that here, but oftentimes that is code for white supremacy, or that is code for like gay white exceptionalism. And it's often like what did some handsome gay white dudes do in the 1980s? And those are valuable lessons. I'm made better by those lessons too. But I think what Charles is saying is that all of those tactics that often get labeled as AIDS activism are part of a bigger picture, and they are part of communities that have been, thriving, surviving, and dying for a lot longer than the United States has been around. And how do we actually support each other in tapping into that? And I think and looking through the lens of HIV is helpful, but then it's good to just to have somebody name, like Charles did, that what we're seeing is something bigger than that.
Right. I mean, and it's important to mark that when we say HIV activism, as much as we might be drawn to 1980s like ACT UP, that people are actually still doing that work now. Like HIV is still happening now. Activism, organizing, care still needs to happen now, in communities all over the world, and communities that we are still very much a part of. And that those communities are connected to other communities, that we're all doing the work of care around these issues and around so many more, whether we realize it or not.
And if I could just add, I think what's really interesting too is that, you know, Charles and I, Charles is 40, I'm 41, we're both part of a generation that I would argue like did not, we were born into a knowledge of HIV maybe, but we weren't born into a world that was actually going to support people being loud and proud around HIV. And so one of the struggles that maybe people our age, struggle is a big word, but one of the challenges that people our age maybe had was to find community rooted in HIV. And for people living with HIV, this meant like how to survive and thrive. And for somebody like me, it meant like how to find community and figure out my role in the world. And I think that those tactics of learning how to survive amid silence are actually quite helpful to this moment, because it's actually that ability to survive in silence that has enabled people like myself, I'll just speak to my own experience, struggle with how protection does not equal fear. You know, as I found it, one of the biggest lessons of my life is that I did not want to be afraid of HIV. I did not want to be afraid of people with HIV. So I thought that closeness and touching and pushing back against ideas of separation were really important. But now we're in a moment where actually distancing is how we save each other's lives. And I'm having a hard time reconciling with all of the lessons that I learned through AIDS activism to this COVID moment. But having an experience of trying to think in silence is giving me the space I need. And hearing people like Charles, like Alex McClelland in Canada, hearing Jessica Whitbread in
Kyrgyzstan.
Kazakhstan, figure out how to thrive in distance has been very helpful.
And I was just gonna add like to if there's any advice, not that like how like anyway, yes, that I would give is around joy and using the tool that was within your toolbox. Like I've also seen an increase as joy as a part of movement, a joy as a part of the work. Label it self-care. I don't want to get into that loaded thing, but I think that there's an innate ability to continue to, you know, to make art about things, to write if that's your thing, to dance it out, to use all of the crayons, right? Because we're stuck in the house. Just use the crayons, like you, and use your imagination around what's possible, because so much is like, right, all these fissures that we're seeing and these failures of our like government and systems that were put in place to protect us are actually opportunities for us to envision a new space. And what is possible now that wasn't possible before is a question I think is important to continue to ask ourselves, both in this very triage moment when people are like is very much, but even when we're let back outside and when we have our second wave in the fall, or you know, who knows what's to come, but what is possible? Because if we don't come up with the ideas, they will fill the gap with their solutions. And by them, I mean the people who control the things that we hate the most, whatever that is for you, the wide swath of the audience, they're going to come up with a solution for that space. And if you don't insert, if we as a people who think differently don't insert our viewpoint and actually operationalize it in many ways, like not just assert it in terms of write the think piece or be in a circular conversation with your other friends, but we're putting like our words into action and practice in whatever ways are possible. And like I actually think it's super hyper possible now because it is such a micro level that we can be on, like because you shouldn't really be going very far, like, you know, again, be concerned with the people that you can touch and be concerned with what y'all can do collectively in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with that in mind, I guess I kind of want to wrap things up by just asking, so a doula is somebody who does, you know, the kind of work that happens during a transition, and we are in a time of transition. The things will change, things are changing. What are some ways that you've been extending care, or that people have extended care to you, that you've found helpful, productive, you just appreciated? What are some of those instances of care that we can kind of hold on to for just a moment?
I'll jump in first. So the way that I've been giving care is one of the ways that I enjoy most is by providing questions, because I think questions are an act of generosity. And so the 4 questions that I invite everyone to think about, especially as we transition from the kind of early crisis panic mode to an understanding that we're going to be in a long emergency, is I would say, like, in that panic crisis mode, what did you do? Why did you do it? what would you do differently, and what needs to happen now? And I would say that folks are well suited to ask that question of themselves and then share those answers with others and have conversations, especially about number 4, what happens now? Because I think a lot of us made really strong, good decisions in the early days, and we fought to survive and thrive with ourselves and our loved ones. But those crisis instincts aren't going to serve us much longer. And so we have to start working together to figure out how we're going to survive, thrive, and die with dignity. And then the care that I've enjoyed the most, people just allowing my idiosyncraticness. So like, if I don't feel like talking, but I want to communicate, letting me just go back and forth on text. That's been really good. Charles and I had a very good Instagram Messenger talk where we got to complain about very controversial things, and that was really meaningful, and I will take that with me to my grave. I will never tell anybody what we spoke about or who we spoke about. And I would say listening to dance remixes.
I've been giving care. I didn't realize I had been giving any care, honestly. I think for me, it's a kind of unconscious act in some ways. And again, I was in therapy yesterday. We're working on that. But I just, I don't think of things in that way. But there was a colleague of mine, whose grandmother died this morning in a nursing home in England. And her family couldn't be with them, and she's in Brooklyn, so she was quite upset. But she was calling me to tell me that, and to just also express how thankful she has been for me as she's been kind of moving through the thing, because she's going to give me kind of constant updates. And it just made me really think, like, when you're like, so I don't know, I guess I'm showing up for people in ways that matter to them. And I think that's, to one extent, it's like not outside of my normal practice of just trying to see people. And the fact that she was my colleague, and most of the times we have like very pressing things to like work on, that I'm always consistent about making space for people to show up first as self in the work, and then we can get to the work. And so having that pay off and be visibilized by her sharing with me was really felt good and important. The ways I've been cared for, I am married to a Taurus who very much enjoys making things comfortable. And I didn't realize that was like a trait of Tauruses. I just thought it was him. But it just really does make a difference, like what thread count you sleep on. Who knew? I didn't take care of myself in the same way, and so I am very much taken care of in that way, of like having creature comforts that surround me, and that feels very important and good. Yeah.
I think it's important. I think in a lot of ways we know what we need, and I think sometimes people also know what they can add to those things that we might not have known that we are.
Yeah, people who see us without us looking is like the best describe it, and like is that I have that built into my life, so I'm very thankful.
Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. I'm hoping that we will get to continue it. Before we sign off, is there anywhere people who are watching this might be able to look at your work, anything else? And I will include links as well when we edit this in. But anywhere that you all would like for us, or things that you're like, go check this out, even if it's not yours.
Well,
I have a website. You could go there. I don't know what's on it right now, but sure, let's go. It's charlesryanlong.com. It's just my full name. You can also follow me on Instagram. I more share other people's interesting things than I do post about stuff, but it's at Disco Jihad. And it's also just fun to say and type. So enjoy that. That's really.
You can go to hivdoula.work to check out the work that we do. You can follow the hashtag COVID doula, where you'll see we're posting daily pages from the zine. I have a website that is tedkerr.club. And I would say, Charles, we should each give a recommendation of something they should check out that is unrelated to us. Is there something that's brought you joy or pleasure or something naughty you want to share?
Oh, you'll actually really enjoy this because we have gotten into, speaking of conversations we've had in the past, the Megan Thee Stallion remix with Beyonce. I am not a beehive. I'm not a
It's
part
true.
of the
It's
hive.
true. You're so brave right now.
I'm a firm unhiver, but this morning played it multiple times. I'm gonna play it more. I'm gonna play it more this afternoon. Can't lie. I've never denigrated Beyonce. Don't come for me.
Don't come for me.
I just But this morning I was like, I get it. Houston, stand up. So listen to that song if you haven't. What's the actual song title?
Savage remix.
It's the Savage remix. It's it makes you want to do things, and it's I was having a whole show in my bathroom this morning at 9:30, so that was exciting.
You heard it here first, kids. Listen to Savage remix.
Yeah, if you heard it here first, you're a nerd. So I went, and my friend social distance gifted me a bunch of like slightly older Vanity Fairs. It is so interesting to read about culture like before COVID hit. It is hilarious. And look at these three people. Just think about their suffering.
Well, Charles and Ted, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. Your questions were a gift.
And let's continue the conversation.
Ciao.
I want to once again thank Ted and Charles for that incredible conversation. If you would like to see more of their work, I will share those links with you. I hope this was a productive conversation for all of you. I would love to continue it. So if you would like to continue it with me, you can hit me up on social media. My Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook handle are all at Edouard Mulfe. Make sure to check out other Zoomoisie episodes, which are released every Thursday. There are some incredible conversations that we want you to be a part of. And with that, I suppose there is no other way to end this than to say, take care.